Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Speak and Feel English, the place where we don't just learn English, we live it through conversation, confidence, and clarity. Today's episode focuses on a topic that many English learners struggle with, even at an intermediate level, understanding the difference between will and going to. These two forms both talk about the future, yet they are not interchangeable in many situations. Ethan, I think this topic is especially useful because learners often understand the grammar rules but still feel unsure when speaking naturally.
Absolutely, Mia. In fact, many fluent speakers use these forms instinctively, not consciously. That means learners who memorize rules often pause too long while deciding which one to use. Our goal today is to help listeners develop not just knowledge, but intuition. By the end of this episode, they should feel confident predicting which structure fits best in real-life conversation.
Let's start with the simplest explanation. Both will and going to refer to the future. However, will is usually used for decisions made at the moment of speaking, predictions based on opinion, promises, and offers. On the other hand, going to is generally used for plans decided earlier and predictions based on evidence you can see now.
That distinction is crucial. Imagine I'm at home and suddenly realize there's no milk. I might say, I will go to the store. The decision happens right now. But if I already planned yesterday to shop this morning, I would say I am going to go to the store. The plan existed before the moment of speaking.
Exactly. So one way to remember this is will equals instant decision. Going to equals prior plan. Let's give listeners another example. Suppose you look outside and see dark clouds gathering rapidly. You might say, it's going to rain. You are not guessing randomly, you are using visible evidence.
Right, but if someone simply asks you what you think about tomorrow's weather and you have no evidence, you might respond, I think it will rain. That's an opinion, not an observation. The difference lies in whether the prediction comes from facts in front of you or from personal belief.
This also affects tone. Sentences with going to often sound more certain because they imply preparation or proof. Meanwhile, will can feel slightly more spontaneous or neutral. For instance, if I say, I will call you later, it sounds like a decision I'm making now. But I'm going to call you later suggests I already intended to do so.
Another important use of will is for promises. If a friend feels worried, you might reassure them by saying, don't worry, I will help you. This is not a plan formed earlier. It's a commitment made in the moment to comfort someone.
And that emotional function is powerful in English. Promises, offers, and voluntary actions strongly favor will. For example, I will carry that bag for you. Or I will explain the process. In both cases, the speaker volunteers immediately.
Let's pause and give listeners a quick summary of what we've covered so far. Use will for spontaneous decisions, promises, offers, and opinion-based predictions. Use going to for earlier plans and predictions supported by visible evidence. That's the core difference, though we will explore nuances throughout this episode.
So, Mia, let's move from theory to real-life situations, because that is where learners truly begin to internalize these forms. Imagine a workplace scenario. A manager suddenly realizes that a report needs to be finished today. They might say, I will handle the report. The decision happens in that moment, in response to the situation.
Exactly. But if the manager had already scheduled time yesterday to complete it, they would more likely say, I'm going to finish the report this afternoon. The sentence signals preparation, not spontaneity. That distinction is subtle, yet native speakers rely on it constantly to communicate intention and reliability.
Let's consider social plans as another example. If a friend texts you asking what you're doing this weekend, and you respond, I will visit my parents, it may sound slightly formal or like you just decided. But I'm going to visit my parents suggests the trip was planned earlier, perhaps with tickets already booked.
Yes, and that's why going to is so common when discussing schedules or arrangements. For instance, people often say, we're going to meet at 7, or I'm going to start a new course next month. These sentences show commitment that existed before the conversation.
Another interesting area is offers.
English speakers almost always use will for offers made in the moment. For example, if someone drops their papers, you might say, "I'll help you pick those up." Using going to here would sound strange because the action wasn't planned.
Right. Offers, promises, and reactions belong to will. If someone looks tired and says they still have work to do, you might respond, "I'll take care of it for you." The structure conveys willingness and immediate support. That emotional nuance is something grammar books rarely emphasize, but it matters in real conversation.
Let's also talk about predictions in a more detailed way. Suppose we are watching a basketball game, and one team is leading by a huge margin with only seconds left. You might say, "They're going to win." The evidence is visible and strong.
But if you're discussing the season before it starts, you might say, "I think they will win the championship." That's a belief or opinion, not a conclusion drawn from immediate evidence. So again, the difference is not about future time itself, but about the speaker's perspective.
This perspective also influences how confident the statement sounds. Going to often implies that something is almost inevitable because preparation or evidence exists. Will leaves more room for uncertainty, unless it's used in a promise or firm declaration.
And this leads us to an important communication tip for learners. When you want to sound organized and intentional, going to can help convey preparation. When you want to sound responsive or decisive, will is usually the better choice.
That's such a practical guideline. Imagine a job interview. If the interviewer asks how you plan to improve your skills, saying, "I'm going to take advanced training courses," sounds like you already have a strategy. Saying, "I will take courses," may sound less prepared, even though grammatically it is correct.
Yes, language choice influences perception. Small grammar decisions can communicate confidence, planning, and commitment. That's why mastering these forms is not just about correctness, it's about clarity and professionalism. Now, we've talked about the core difference between will and going to, and we've explored how real-life situations influence which form sounds more natural. Now let's discuss something learners often ask about: situations where both forms are technically correct, but one sounds more appropriate depending on context.
That's a great point, because English isn't always about strict right or wrong choices. Sometimes both forms work grammatically, yet they communicate slightly different attitudes or levels of certainty. For example, imagine someone asks, "What are your plans for tonight?" You could say, "I will stay home," or "I'm going to stay home." Both refer to the future, but they don't feel identical.
Exactly. "I'm going to stay home" sounds like a pre-existing plan. Maybe you already decided earlier in the day. Meanwhile, "I will stay home" could sound like you're deciding in that very moment, perhaps after considering other options. So the difference isn't about correctness, but about the timing of the decision.
Another common mistake learners make is overusing will for every future sentence, simply because it feels easier. For instance, someone might say, "Tomorrow I will meet my friends, I will go to a restaurant, and I will watch a movie." Grammatically, this is fine, but it doesn't sound natural if all those activities were planned earlier.
Right. In that case, native speakers would usually say, "Tomorrow I'm going to meet my friends, then we're going to go to a restaurant, and later we're going to watch a movie." The repeated use of "going to" signals a planned schedule, which feels more realistic and conversational.
Another mistake happens with predictions. Learners sometimes say, "I'm going to think it will be difficult." That mixes the forms incorrectly. Instead, they should separate the idea. "I think it will be difficult." The verb think already signals opinion, so will is the natural choice afterward.
Yes, and here's another subtle point. When you make a quick decision during a conversation, will almost always sounds best. Imagine we're talking and suddenly realize we need coffee. I might say, "I'll make some coffee." Saying, "I'm going to make some coffee" in that moment could sound like I had already planned it, which isn't true.
That immediacy is key. The moment of decision shapes the grammar. Similarly, when responding to requests, English strongly prefers will. If someone asks, "Can you send me the file?" a natural answer is, "Yes, I'll send it right away." Using going to might sound less immediate or slightly distant.
Let's also discuss tone in professional communication. In emails or meetings, will often sounds more formal and decisive. For example, "I will review the proposal and respond tomorrow" sounds confident and responsible. Meanwhile, "I'm going to review the proposal" sounds slightly more conversational, though still correct.
That's true. Business English sometimes favors will because it emphasizes commitment. However, when presenting future strategies or company plans, professionals frequently use going to. For instance, we're going to expand our services next year, suggests the plan already exists and is part of a broader strategy.
So the choice isn't only grammatical, it's strategic communication. You're signaling how fixed the future action is and how prepared you are. This awareness is what moves learners from intermediate to advanced fluency. Let's continue exploring how will and going to function in more advanced communication. One area where these forms interact strongly with meaning is when we add time expressions. Words like tonight, soon, next year, or in a few minutes often influence which structure sounds more natural, even when both are technically correct.
That's right. For example, if I say, I'll call you in a few minutes, it sounds like I've just decided to do it. But if I say, I'm going to call you in a few minutes, it suggests I already planned to do so before speaking. The time phrase doesn't change the grammar rule, but it highlights the intention behind it.
Another important factor is storytelling. When people narrate future intentions within a story, they often use going to describe plans that existed at that time in the past. For example, we were going to travel across the country, but the weather changed everything. The structure helps listeners understand that the plan existed before the interruption.
Yes, and storytelling also reveals how will expresses determination. Imagine someone describing a personal goal. They might say, I will succeed no matter what happens. Here, will doesn't just refer to the future, it communicates strong resolve and confidence.
That emotional strength is why motivational speech often relies on will. Statements like, we will overcome this challenge, or I will keep improving, feel powerful because they sound like promises or commitments rather than simple plans.
Let's talk about conversational rhythm as well. In fast, natural speech, will is often contracted to I'll, you'll, or they'll. These contractions make sentences smoother and more spontaneous. For instance, I'll send it tonight feels quick and responsive, which suits the function of will.
Meanwhile, going to often becomes gonna in informal spoken English. So you might hear someone say, I'm going to start working out next week. While this form should be avoided in formal writing, it's extremely common in everyday conversation and helps learners recognize natural speech patterns.
This brings up an important listening skill. Learners sometimes understand grammar in written form but struggle to recognize it in fast speech. If someone says, I'm gonna call you, they might not realize it corresponds to I am going to call you. Becoming aware of these reductions is key to real-world fluency.
Absolutely. Another advanced point involves negotiations or polite communication. Using going to can make future actions sound more collaborative and less forceful. For example, we're going to review your request and discuss options feels inclusive. Saying, we will review your request sounds more authoritative and final.
That difference in tone is subtle but meaningful. Leaders, teachers, and managers often adjust their grammar intentionally to shape how their message feels. Language is not just information, it's atmosphere.
Let's also mention that sometimes English speakers deliberately choose will to show flexibility. If I say, I'll see what I can do, it implies openness rather than a fixed plan. But if I say, I'm going to see what I can do, it might suggest I already intend to take action.
Exactly. These nuances may seem small, but they add layers of meaning. Once learners begin noticing them, they start sounding more natural and expressive.
As we reach the final part of today's discussion, I think this is the perfect time to bring everything together in a way that listeners can actually apply in real conversations. We've explored rules, real-life situations, tone differences, and even advanced nuances. But what learners really need is a simple mental process they can follow when speaking. Mia, if someone had only a few seconds to decide between will and going to, what should they ask themselves first?
That's a great way to frame it. The first question should always be, did I decide this right now, or did I decide it earlier? If the decision is happening at the moment of speaking, will is usually the best choice. For example, if someone asks who can answer an email and you respond immediately, saying, I'll do it sounds natural and responsive. But if you had already planned to do it earlier, I'm going to do it communicates preparation.
So the first checkpoint is timing of the decision. The second question could be, am I making a promise, an offer, or a commitment? If the answer is yes, then will almost always fits better. English speakers rely on it for reassurance. Sentences like, I will support you, I will be there, or I will fix the problem sound dependable and intentional.
Exactly. Now, the third question should be about predictions. If you are basing your prediction on what you can see or evidence in front of you, then going to sounds stronger. For instance, if you see someone carrying heavy boxes and walking toward a door, you might say, you're going to drop those. You're reacting to visible reality. But if you simply believe something will happen without direct evidence, will is the better choice, as in, I think you will enjoy the event.
That's such a useful distinction. It turns grammar into a decision tree rather than a memorized rule. Another practical tip involves planning language. When you talk about schedules, appointments, or long-term goals, going to often sounds more organized. If someone says, I'm going to start a new project next month, it suggests preparation and intention rather than a sudden thought.
Yes, and that's why this structure appears frequently when people discuss personal growth or future plans. It subtly signals seriousness. On the other hand, will often carries emotional energy. If someone says, I will never give up, the sentence expresses determination rather than scheduling. That emotional difference is something learners should listen for in movies, interviews, and speeches.
Let's also remind listeners that fluency develops through exposure. It's helpful to notice how native speakers switch between these forms naturally. When someone says, I'll call you later, they often mean they just decided to do it, or they're reassuring you. When they say, I'm going to call you later, they often mean it was already part of their plan. Listening for that intention helps build instinct over time. Another important idea is that mistakes with these forms rarely block understanding. If a learner uses will instead of going to, the listener will still understand the future meaning. So the goal isn't perfection, it's refinement. Each improvement makes your speech sound more natural and more aligned with how English is actually used in daily life. That's a really encouraging point. Sometimes learners hesitate too much because they want to be exact. But communication works best when you focus on clarity first, then polish your accuracy gradually. These small grammar choices are like fine-tuning your voice rather than building it from scratch. So let's give everyone a final quick checklist they can remember. Ask yourself, did I decide this now? Use will. Did I decide earlier? Use going to. Am I making a promise or offering help? Use will. Am I describing a plan or evidence-based prediction? Use going to. If learners keep those 4 questions in mind, they'll handle most situations with confidence. And as always, the real improvement comes from practice. Try describing your day, your plans, or your predictions aloud. Notice which form feels more natural in each situation. The more you practice in real contexts, the faster these choices become automatic. Exactly. Language mastery is not about memorizing lists. It's about building habits of thought. Once your mind connects intention with structure, grammar stops feeling like a rulebook and starts feeling like a tool. That's a perfect note to end on. Today we explored the future in English from multiple angles, and hopefully our listeners now feel more confident using both will and going to in conversations, at work, and in everyday life. Thank you for spending this time with us and continuing to grow your English with every episode. And for more lessons, conversations, and practical speaking guidance, make sure you subscribe to the channel and explore all the podcast episodes available.